It is the 11th of June, 1944, 5 days after the landings, and a German officer is being marched through a Normandy orchard under guard. He has been captured near Tilly-sur-Seulles, where his battalion spent the previous 48 hours trying to hold a hedgerow line against men they never saw. He is not shaken by the naval guns, nor by the endless procession of Allied aircraft overhead. What has rattled him is smaller than all of that, and far more personal. 3 of his officers, he says through an interpreter, were killed by single shots to the head at ranges his own men considered impossible to judge, let alone hit. He uses a word that keeps recurring in British intelligence reports from this campaign, a word that sounds almost childish next to the machinery of total war: unfair. War, in his understanding, was fought with artillery barrages and armoured thrusts, with weight of fire and weight of steel. What he had just experienced was something closer to being hunted, one careful shot at a time, by men who could not be seen and rarely, if ever, missed. That accusation of unfairness is worth pausing on, because it is not really a complaint about death. Soldiers on every side accepted death as the cost of the job. What unsettled this officer, and countless others like him across the hedgerows of Normandy, the ruins of Caen, and later the flooded polders of the Netherlands, was precision without warning. A shell might land anywhere. A machine gun sprayed an area, not a man. But a single rifle shot that took an officer through the temple at 400 meters, fired from a position that could not be located even after minutes of searching, felt like something outside the rules of ordinary combat. This is the story of the weapon and the training system that produced that feeling. A rifle so accurate and so quietly effective that it altered how German troops moved, spoke, and thought whenever they suspected a British sniper was within range. It is a story about a piece of engineering barely different in appearance from the standard infantry rifle carried by a million other soldiers, and about the deliberate, almost obsessive craft that turned it into one of the most feared instruments of the entire war. To understand why this mattered, you have to go back to a lesson the British Army had already learned once, at devastating cost, and then almost entirely forgotten. In the opening years of the First World War, German snipers using commercial hunting rifles fitted with telescopic sights had inflicted casualties on British troops so severe and so demoralizing that entire sectors of trench became unsafe to raise a head above the parapet in daylight. British marksmanship at the time relied on the standard-issue Lee Enfield with iron sights, adequate for volume fire but hopeless against a concealed man with magnified optics. It took until 1915 for a dedicated British sniping and scouting organization to emerge, largely through the efforts of a big-game hunter-turned-officer named Hesketh Pritchard, who built training schools, refined optical equipment, and eventually helped claw back the initiative. By 1918, British snipers were arguably the best in the world. Then, in the way that armies so often discard hard lessons once the guns fall silent, the whole apparatus was allowed to wither. Sniping was treated in the interwar years as a curiosity rather than a discipline. Funding dried up, the specialist schools closed, and the accumulated expertise scattered into civilian life along with the men who held it. When war came again in 1939, the British Army entered it with barely a fraction of the sniping capability it had possessed 20 years earlier. Standard-issue rifles were unmodified, telescopic sights were scarce and of inconsistent quality, and formal sniper training was almost non-existent below the level of a few enthusiast regiments. German forces, by contrast, had never entirely abandoned the discipline, fielding carabiner 98K rifles fitted with Zeiss or Ajax optics and troops with at least some grounding in fieldcraft. In the early campaigns in France and North Africa, this imbalance showed. British units repeatedly reported enemy marksmen picking off officers and NCOs at ranges their own men simply could not match, and there was, for a period, no adequate answer. The scale of the problem was not measured only in casualties, though those mounted steadily enough to alarm commanders. It was measured in the paralysis that a handful of well-placed enemy shots could inflict on an entire company. Advances stalled because nobody wanted to be the second man to stand up after the first went down for no visible reason. Officers, easily identified by their bearing, their maps, or simply by the deference of the men around them, became reluctant to move in the open at all, which in turn slowed decision-making at exactly the moments it mattered most. A single, skilled sniper, properly concealed, could tie down 100 men for hours. Britain needed not merely a better rifle, but an entire system, a weapon manufactured to a tolerance well beyond ordinary infantry standards, an optical sight rugged enough to survive Normandy mud and North African sand alike, and a training pipeline capable of producing soldiers who could exploit both to their absolute limit. Building any one of those three things would have been demanding. Building all three in the middle of a war already straining British industry to its limits looked close to impossible. The rifle that emerged from this effort was, on the surface, an unremarkable modification of an existing design. The base weapon was the Lee-Enfield No. 4 Mark I, the standard British infantry rifle of the Second World War, manufactured in huge numbers at factories including the Royal Ordnance Factory at Fazakerley near Liverpool and by BSA, the Birmingham Small Arms Company. What made the sniper variant, designated the No. 4 Mark I T, extraordinary was not any radical redesign but an almost artisanal attention to selection and craftsmanship layered on top of mass production. Rifles destined to become snipers were not simply pulled at random from the factory line. Each one was test-fired and examined for exceptional accuracy before being set aside, a process that meant only a small fraction of any given production batch, sometimes as few as one in several hundred, was judged good enough for conversion. Those selected rifles were then sent to Holland and Holland, the London gunmaker better known for crafting bespoke shotguns for the aristocracy than for supplying the armed forces, and it was here that the transformation happened. Skilled gunsmiths fitted a cast bronze bracket to the left side of the receiver, precisely bedded and pinned so that it could hold a telescopic sight rigidly enough to return to exact zero, even after the rifle had been removed and refitted repeatedly in the field, a detail that sounds mundane until you consider that a sight moving even a fraction of a millimeter out of alignment could send a bullet meters wide of its target at 400 yards. The scope itself, the No. 32, was a 3-power optic, roughly equivalent in magnification to a decent pair of opera glasses, yet engineered to withstand rain, cold, recoil, and rough handling without losing its calibration, a genuinely difficult achievement with the optical glass technology of the era. The whole assembly, rifle and scope together, weighed a little under 5 kilograms, not dramatically heavier than the standard infantry weapon, which mattered enormously to men who might have to carry it, motionless, through freezing hedgerows for hours at a stretch. In trained hands, the No. 4 T was capable of consistent first-round hits on a man-sized target out to roughly 600 meters, and reliable hits on a head-sized target at 200 to 300 meters, a level of precision that exceeded almost anything the German Kar 98K and its optics could match under equivalent field conditions, largely because the German mounting systems were more prone to shifting zero, and the mass-produced Zeiss scopes varied more in quality than the hand-fitted No. 32. Muzzle velocity sat at around 740 meters per second, the crack of the shot itself sharp enough to be mistaken, at a distance, for a branch snapping or a vehicle backfiring, which was precisely the acoustic camouflage that made these weapons so disorienting to men under fire. Production numbers remain difficult to state with total confidence, since wartime records on conversions were not always kept with the same rigor as figures for standard rifle output, but estimates place total No. 4 T conversions somewhere in the region of 26,000 over the course of the war, a strikingly small number set against the millions of standard Lee-Enfields produced, and a figure that underlines just how selective and painstaking the whole process was. The rifle alone, however brilliant, would have achieved little without the men trained to use it, and here the British Army rebuilt from something close to nothing. Sniper training was reconstituted through schools such as the one established at Bisley, drawing on veterans of the earlier war and on gamekeepers, stalkers, and rural marksmen, whose civilian skills in patience and fieldcraft translated with unusual directness onto the battlefield. Trainees learned not merely to shoot but to observe for hours without moving, to read wind and light, to construct hides that would survive close inspection, and to estimate range by eye with an accuracy that seems almost implausible today. Officers such as Captain Clifford Shore, who later documented much of this world in his own post-war writing, helped codify lessons that turned raw talent into repeatable doctrine, so that a soldier finishing the course brought home not just a good eye but a complete discipline of concealment, patience, and restraint, since a sniper who fired and was located had usually fired his last shot of the war. By the time of the Normandy campaign, that combination of weapon and training had matured into something the German army had not adequately prepared for. Along the bocage country, where thick hedgerows carved the landscape into a maze of small blind fields, British and Canadian snipers found terrain almost perfectly suited to their skills, able to hold a single position for a day or more, picking off officers, radio operators, and machine gun crews at ranges that made retaliation nearly impossible. Sergeant Harry Furness, one of the more widely documented British snipers of the campaign, was credited with dozens of confirmed kills through this period, though as with most sniping records of the era, precise verified totals remain elusive, and any figures quoted should be treated as informed estimates rather than exact tallies, since the fog and chaos of hedgerow fighting made independent confirmation difficult even at the time. What is better documented is the psychological effect. German after-action accounts and prisoner interrogations from this period repeatedly mention a reluctance to move in daylight, a habit of crouching even well behind the front line, and the particular dread reserved for positions that had recently lost an officer to a single, unexplained shot. Later, in the fighting around Arnhem and into the Rhineland advance of early 1945, similar patterns recur in the surviving records, though the closer the war moves to its end, the thinner and more fragmentary the documentation becomes. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's a great deal more of this story still to come. Set against its German counterpart, the number 4, T, reveals its advantages most clearly in consistency rather than raw specification. The Kar 98K with Zeiss Zielvier optics was, on paper, a comparable weapon, and in the hands of Germany's most experienced marksmen, it remained genuinely dangerous throughout the war. But German scope mounts, produced under increasing wartime pressure and material shortage as the conflict progressed, proved more prone to losing zero, and the quality of glass and coating varied considerably between manufacturers as the war ground on and standards slipped under Allied bombing of optical works. American forces, meanwhile, fielded the M1903A4 and later variants of the M1 Garand adapted for sniping, both hampered to different degrees by mounting systems that sat awkwardly with the rifle's action, making the number 4 T's purpose-built bronze bracket look, by comparison, like a masterclass in restrained engineering. It is worth noting, too, that the British approach of hand-selecting only the most accurate rifles from standard production, rather than manufacturing a wholly separate sniper rifle from scratch, was a pragmatic solution born of wartime resource limits and one that several other nations, including the Soviet Union with its selected Mosin-Nagant rifles, arrived at through similar logic, suggesting this was less a uniquely British insight than a shared wartime solution to a shared production problem, even if the British execution, through Holland and Holland's craftsmanship, is often judged the most refined of the lot. The material impact of British sniping in the Second World War is genuinely difficult to quantify, and any account that claims precise casualty figures should be read with some skepticism, since regimental diaries rarely distinguished sniper kills from other small arms fire with total reliability. What can be said with more confidence is that the psychological effect was consistently and repeatedly noted by German prisoners and by British and Canadian officers alike, who observed enemy troops altering basic battlefield behavior, movement, posture, even the pace of retreat, specifically because of the fear of an unseen marksman. That kind of influence rarely shows up in a body count, yet it shaped the tempo of entire engagements. The legacy of the weapon outlived the war by decades. The number 4, T, formed the direct basis for the post-war L4 2A1 sniper rifle, which remained in British service into the 1990s, a remarkable span of operational relevance for a design rooted in 1940s workshop craftsmanship. Surviving examples can today be seen in the collections of the Imperial War Museum in London and the National Firearms Centre in Leeds, quiet museum pieces that give little outward hint of the fear they once carried onto a Normandy hedgerow. Return for a moment to that orchard near Tilly-sur-Seulles, and to the officer being marched away under guard, still turning over that word, unfair, as though searching for a rule of war he felt had been broken. No rule had been broken. What had happened to him was simply the product of a small bronze bracket fitted with obsessive care by a London gunmaker, a factory-fresh rifle selected from among hundreds for its exceptional accuracy, and a soldier trained for months to lie motionless in a hedge until the single correct moment to fire. There was no dishonor in any of it, and no trick beyond patience, craftsmanship, and discipline applied more rigorously than the other side had thought possible. It was not unfair. It was simply better in the narrow, deadly sense that mattered most on a battlefield. Better engineering, better selection, better training, brought together and aimed with a precision that turned a standard infantry rifle into one of the most feared weapons any German soldier in Normandy would ever encounter. The men who carried the number 4, T, rarely spoke of what they had done, then or later, and the weapon itself looks, even now in its glass museum case, almost too ordinary to have earned the word an enemy general once used to describe it. But ordinary is exactly what it was built to look like. That, in the end, was the whole point.